The silence of the Blackwood National Forest in late October was not a passive thing. It was a dense physical entity that pressed against the eardrums, smelling of damp cedar and the inevitable rot of winter. It was a silence Ranger Elias Thorne had known intimately for 18 years, a silence that usually promised solitude and predictable ecological rhythms. That morning, however, the silence was fractured. It was broken not by a sound, but by an unsettling absence of sound, a pocket of unnatural nullity centered deep within Sector Delta 9, a region so remote it was rarely patrolled more than once a month. Elias had been tracing a barely discernible game trail, documenting the health of a dying stand of ancient hemlocks, when the expected ambient noise of the woods, the skittering of squirrels, the drip of condensation, the sigh of wind through the high canopy, simply dissolved. This sudden void was the initial hook, the instant the forest ceased being familiar wilderness and became something profoundly alien. Elias stopped his ATV, cutting the engine, and let the sudden mechanical silence wash over him. He stood up, towering over the machine, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He strained to hear the customary hum of the distant highway or the cry of a high-flying hawk, but there was nothing, only the frantic, thumping rhythm of his own pulse, hammering against the absolute stillness. It was the kind of unnatural quiet that predates a massive storm, or worse, the kind of quiet that means every living creature nearby has already fled or been silenced by a greater, more immediate threat. He checked his map coordinates, noting his precise location, a procedural reflex meant to anchor him to reality. He was miles from any designated trail, easily 7 miles as the crow flies from the nearest logging road. There was simply no logical explanation for the disturbance he felt, this deep, sickening shift in the forest's atmosphere. His experience, his long, lonely tenure in Blackwood, taught him that anomalies in the wilderness were almost always human in origin, an illegal campsite, abandoned hunting gear, or tragically, a missing person. But this felt colder, cleaner, almost surgical in its wrongness. Elias re-engaged his focus, pushing past the immediate dread. He dismounted the ATV, slinging his rifle across his back, and began to walk, slowly, systematically, moving deeper into the zone of unnatural stillness. The ground beneath his heavy boots was treacherous, a thick layer of decomposing needles hiding slick moss and broken shale. He moved with the trained economy of a man who trusts only his senses. The first tangible evidence came approximately 40 yards past the ATV, half hidden beneath the flared root system of a massive Douglas fir. It was a flash of color so vivid it seemed radioactive against the muted browns and grays of the autumnal forest floor. He crouched low, his joints protesting the movement, and reached out a gloved hand. It was a child's mitten. Not merely a mitten, but a small, pristine, lime-green mitten, brightly knit, perhaps sized for a child no older than 5 or 6. It was unsettlingly clean. There were no traces of mud, no evidence of water saturation, and it hadn't begun to decompose. It looked as if it had been dropped moments ago, perhaps freshly laundered, yet the fabric was unnaturally dry and slightly stiff, almost preserved. Elias's professional composure began to crack. Children did not wander 7 miles off trail unassisted in the deep Blackwood wilderness. Lost hikers, yes, confused elderly people occasionally. But children of this age were always accompanied, always reported missing within hours, and almost always searched for along the main arteries of the park. No missing persons report fitting this description had crossed his desk in months. He turned a slow, complete circle, studying the forest floor. The soil here was a rich, dark loam, notoriously receptive to impressions. If a small child had been here, or even an adult carrying a child, there would be tracks, scuffs, compressions, broken foliage. But the surrounding area was undisturbed. The leaf litter lay flat and unmarred, save for the distinct deep treads of his own boots. The mitten was simply there, placed, not dropped accidentally during a desperate flight or a careless moment. This immediate jarring contradiction, the clean, clear sign of human presence juxtaposed with the absolute lack of surrounding evidence, was the knot that began to tighten in Elias's gut, pulling him deeper into the mystery. He opened his field kit and carefully documented the find, taking photographs before placing the small garment into a sterile evidence bag. As he stood back up, A sudden, sharp instinct pulled him toward the east. It wasn't a visual cue, but a sudden, almost magnetic sense that the line of wrongness extended in that direction. He ignored the practical need to follow his own tracks back. The professional had been momentarily overridden by the hunter. The man who knew something dark was hiding just beyond the sightline. The path he now followed was non-existent, demanding that he push through dense underbrush, tangles of blackberry vines and thickets of spruce saplings. The branches seemed to clutch at his clothing, pulling at him with a desperate resistance, as if the forest itself were trying to bar his passage. The objects began to appear with a calculated, terrifying regularity, spaced roughly 20 to 30 yards apart, leading him further and further into the secluded bowl of the valley. First, half submerged in a shallow depression filled with stagnant water, was a small plastic hair clip shaped like a ladybug, bright red and black, again impossibly clean despite its location. It had the weight and cheap manufacture of a giveaway toy, but its presence here, miles from civilization, was an escalating nightmare. Next, draped over a low-hanging branch of a yew, was a brightly woven lanyard, the kind used to hold ID badges or keys, but this one bore the small, crudely drawn logo of a local elementary school, Pioneer Ridge Primary. Elias recognized the logo instantly. Pioneer Ridge was nearly 50 miles away, on the far side of the park boundary. The distance alone made the object's location a statistical impossibility for a casual drop. He stopped again, the cold beginning to permeate his thick field jacket, but the chill he felt was internal. This was no longer an accident. This was a deliberate breadcrumb trail. Someone or something was guiding him. The chilling realization was that the person placing these items had to have moved through this dense, trackless wilderness without leaving any sign of their passage or the passage of the children whose belongings they carried. He reached for his radio, his hand shaking slightly as he pulled the handset from its clip. He needed to report the findings to start a formal investigation, but the moment he thumbed the transmit button, the radio remained stubbornly silent. He pressed it again, checking the battery and the channel. Nothing. Not static, not interference, but a dead, echoing silence. The zone of unnatural nullity was actively blocking all forms of external communication. He was entirely isolated, enveloped in the quiet horror he was pursuing. The sun, which had been low and weak, now began its swift, brutal descent behind the thick canopy, bleeding the remaining color from the woods. The light became a sickly, watery gray, and the shadows elongated, distorting the familiar shapes of the trees into predatory figures. Elias continued forward, driven by a perverse, morbid curiosity now mixed with genuine, escalating fear. The pattern was clear. Small, innocuous objects belonging to multiple different children, all leading to a specific, hidden destination. He found a brightly colored bead from a bracelet, a single plastic dinosaur figurine with one leg broken off, and then, most unsettlingly, a slightly scuffed but otherwise intact leather toddler shoe, size 6, set deliberately on top of a low, moss-covered boulder. It was the first piece of clothing that directly implied the potential fate of a child, and the sight of it stopped Elias dead. He stood there for several minutes, catching his breath, trying to force his mind back into the procedural mode of investigation. Why leave the objects? Why guide someone here? And where, oh where, were the owners? He knew intellectually that he should retreat, get to higher ground and try to establish radio contact, but the toddler shoe held him captive. It was arranged so carefully, resting upright as if waiting for its pair, that it spoke volumes about the calculation and intent behind this bizarre trail. He realized with a chilling clarity that this was not a place of accidental loss. It was a site of deliberate staging. Finally, the forest began to thin slightly. He had entered a geological depression, a small bowl-shaped clearing nestled between 3 high ridges, a spot invisible from the air and inaccessible by anything but dedicated bushwhacking. As he stepped across the final perimeter of dense spruce, the transition was physical, immediate and terrifyingly complete. The ground of the clearing was flat, covered in a mix of smooth, dark earth and fine, pale sand, unusual for this region of Blackwood. The air here was noticeably colder and possessed a distinct metallic scent, like old iron or ozone, There was no wind, not a whisper. Even the cracking of his own boots on the hard earth seemed deafeningly loud in the oppressive stillness. This space, he realized immediately, was wrong. It was too perfect, too barren, a wound in the heart of the teeming forest life. He raised his eyes, scanning the perimeter, his heart slamming against his ribs like a trapped bird. And then he saw it. The object of the journey, the final horrifying destination that the breadcrumb trail had been engineered to reveal. Centered in the dead middle of the unnatural clearing was a formation that defied rational explanation, a sight so profoundly bizarre and terrifying that Elias felt his mind momentarily seize up, failing to process the visual input. It was a circle, not a rough organic oval, but a precise, geometrically perfect circle, perhaps 30 feet in diameter. And arrayed around the circumference of that circle, spaced with chilling uniformity, were shoes, dozens of them. He took 3 hesitant steps forward, compelled by a force stronger than fear, and began to count, his lips moving silently, confirming the impossible arithmetic. They were all children's shoes, little sneakers, tiny leather sandals, brightly colored rain boots, simple canvas slippers. He saw Velcro straps, frayed laces, and the faded logos of cartoon characters. The sheer volume was staggering. He counted meticulously, stopping his count only when the number settled sickeningly in his mind. 40 pairs, 80 individual shoes, and the arrangement was the most horrifying detail of all. Every single pair was set upright, perfectly aligned toe to heel, resting on the hard earth. And every single shoe, every single one of the 80 items, faced outward, toward the dense surrounding forest, as if the children had collectively stepped out of them and walked into the woods beyond. Elias stood at the edge of the circle, breathing shallowly, unable to move. The silence that had led him here now seemed to emanate directly from this formation. It was a silence born of deliberate, profound emptiness. 40 pairs of shoes, 40 pairs of missing children, arranged in a perfect cold geometry of despair. It wasn't just the fact of the shoes, it was the chilling intent behind the meticulous arrangement that shattered his remaining sense of professional detachment. This was not the work of a hiker, a camper, or a lost soul. This was ritual. This was design. He instinctively reached for his radio again, hoping the sight of this atrocity had somehow broken the electromagnetic barrier, but the handset remained lifelessly cold in his hand. He needed backup, forensic teams, search parties, the National Guard, but he was alone staring into the dark heart of a monstrous, incomprehensible event. He had found the end of the trail, but the real mystery, where the children had gone and who had created this terrifying shrine, had just begun. He slowly pulled out his satellite phone, a dedicated high-power emergency device, realizing that despite protocol and the immediate threat to his life by being in this secluded spot, the urgency of this discovery superseded everything else. He had to report the circle. He had to start the machine. His gaze flickered once more over the 40 silent, accusing pairs of shoes, and he forced himself to look away, toward the only way out, the dark path from which he had come. He knew with a terrible certainty that the second he turned his back on that perfect circle to make the call, the nature of the silence surrounding him would change forever. The initial shock had calcified into a relentless, icy dread that burrowed deep beneath Elias Thorne's breastbone, a dull, aching weight that no amount of physical exertion or forced rationality could dislodge. The 40 pairs of shoes, still imprinted upon the soft, loamy earth of the clearing, even after the official and appallingly cursory police sweep, mocked the very concept of order, yet screamed of an impossible, chilling meticulousness. It was the absolute perfection of the arrangement that haunted him, the geometric precision that felt less like a crime scene and more like a bizarre, unspoken ceremony performed by entities possessing an otherworldly patience. The deputies from the county sheriff's office, having spent a meager 90 minutes at the site before declaring the scene contained no evidence of immediate foul play and listing the footwear as abandoned personal property, had missed the core horror entirely, choosing to focus on the lack of blood spatter or disturbed earth. Elias, however, could not unsee the arrangement. He remembered every scuff mark, every faded cartoon character on canvas, the specific shade of teal on a tiny rain boot that looked barely worn. He had meticulously documented, even after the deputies told him to stand down, the exact dimensions of the circle. It possessed a diameter of precisely 4 meters, with each pair equidistant from its neighbor, rotated slightly inward toward the absolute center, a mathematical feat far beyond the random whims of the wind or the casual cruelty of nature. The shoes hadn't been thrown, they had been placed. Elias's mind became a relentless loop of logistical impossibilities. If 40 children had simultaneously shed their footwear, where were the tracks leading away? The clearing itself was bordered by dense, practically impenetrable rhododendron thickets and Douglas firs whose undergrowth consisted of centuries of accumulated spongy debris that held a track like wet cement. Yet aside from the heavy, clumsy imprints of the deputy's patrol boots and his own size 12s, the surrounding forest floor was pristine, untouched by the small, light footfall of 80 retreating feet. It was as if the children, having performed their silent, synchronized disrobing of soles and laces, had simply risen vertically into the dense, oppressive canopy above and vanished into the high, whispering air currents that eternally flowed through the Olympic Peninsula. He was back in his cabin now, the scent of damp wool and pine needles thick in the air, but his true self remained anchored to that sinister clearing. He stared at the printouts of the photographs he had taken, laid out across the scarred wooden dining table, a desperate gallery of tiny lost lives. He zoomed in on the detail that had momentarily paralyzed him during the initial sweep, a detail so small the deputies had literally kicked dirt over it in their haste, the single anomalous item. Tucked deeply inside the left shoe of a pair of faded red Keds, size roughly 9 toddler, was a small, perfectly preserved feather. It wasn't the coarse brown or grey of a common local bird, nor the telltale iridescent sheen of a raven or crow, but a startling, brilliant white feather, delicately curved and possessing an almost translucent quality. It felt impossibly light, yet its presence was heavier than any stone. Elias had worked in the wilderness for 17 years, he knew birds. This feather belonged to nothing native to the upper coastal forests of the Northwest. It looked impossibly like the downy feather of a swan, a bird miles inland, or perhaps even a species entirely alien to the continent. Its placement was intentional, not debris but an offering or perhaps a signature. This observation formed the second, sharper hook that tightened the line of fear in his gut. The perfection of the circle spoke of ritual. The alien white feather spoke of a foreign presence, an outside influence that defied geographical and ecological norms. The local police theory, a cult scattering evidence of a past ceremony, perhaps miles away, or a particularly cruel localized instance of dumping trash, felt woefully inadequate, a bureaucratic effort to cap a bubbling well of pure, unadulterated mystery. Elias had been formally told to limit his engagement, to resume his standard patrol duties, checking boundaries, clearing fallen timber, educating tourists. But the forest, which had always been his sanctuary and his home, now felt like a sprawling, meticulously arranged tomb. The familiar sounds, the rustle of ferns, the distant call of a Steller's jay, were now overlaid with the imagined whisper of children's voices, the tap-tap of small shoes being set down gently on the forest floor. He needed history. He had begun the exhaustive, mind-numbing task of sifting through the archived ranger logbooks dating back to the establishment of the district in the 1930s. The paper was brittle, yellowed, and smelled faintly of mildew and ancient tobacco smoke. He worked under the sputtering light of a desk lamp, the silence of the night pressing in on the walls of his remote cabin like a physical force. He wasn't looking for another circle. He was looking for patterns of displacement, incidents where the forest seemed to swallow people whole, specifically children. The logs were full of the usual tragedies: hikers unprepared for the rapid shifts in weather, fishermen lost in the swirling fogs, the occasional hermit found decades later as bone dust. But several entries, usually brief and always unsatisfactorily resolved, stood out like wounds on the historical record. There was the incident in 1952. 3 children, ages 5, 7, and 9, brothers and sister, vanished from established campsite near the White River confluence. No struggle reported, Family reported they simply weren't there upon waking. Search inconclusive. Attributed to potential swift water drowning, though bodies were never recovered. Then, a particularly chilling entry from 1978. Local logging crew reported finding numerous children's toys, perfectly clean, stacked neatly against a cedar stump near Section 12. No corresponding missing persons report filed. Crew spooked, refused to return to site. Toys collected and held in evidence for 6 months, then disposed of. Elias felt a cold prickle along his arms. Toys. Clean. Stacked neatly. The compulsion for order was recurring, an invisible signature left across decades. The real escalation came on the third morning after the discovery, when Elias risked an unauthorized return to the clearing. He carried his old compass and a specialized magnetic sensor originally designed to detect old metal forestry markers buried deep beneath the earth. He walked slowly, deliberately, focusing on the center of the circle. He calculated that if the shoes were a peripheral marker, the core event, whatever it was, must have happened at the epicenter of the formation. The sensor remained silent as he traversed the circle's radius, but exactly at the midpoint, the instrument gave a sudden, piercing shriek. It wasn't the low, familiar groan of iron or steel. The frequency was high-pitched, almost musical, and rapidly faded. Elias dropped to his knees, scraping away the top layer of rich, dark earth. He dug with a small trowel, his breath hitching in his throat, expecting metal or bone or something monstrously out of place. Instead, he found only soil thick with roots, yet the reading persisted, weaker now, emanating from a deep, pressurized point. He dug deeper, nearly half a meter down, when his hand brushed against something unnaturally smooth and solid. It was flat, cold, and felt less like natural stone and more like polished material. He excavated the object carefully. It was a tablet, no larger than his palm, made of a dark, obsidian-like material that absorbed the meager forest light. It was absolutely featureless. No carvings, no writing, no discernible marks of manufacture. It was only after he brushed the last bits of clinging earth from its surface that he realized the source of the magnetic disturbance. The entire object resonated with a faint, persistent hum of static electricity, and when he placed the magnetic sensor near it, the instrument went wild, spiking, and then immediately shutting down, overloaded by a non-standard magnetic field. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a bizarre historical footnote or a tragedy solved by natural causes. This was engineered, deliberate, and clearly concealed. No one drops a technologically or structurally advanced piece of material into the center of a perfect circle of missing children's shoes by accident. The tablet was too small to be a structural marker and too smooth to be a primitive tool. It felt like a key, or perhaps a recording device left to monitor the perimeter defined by the silent audience of empty footwear. As he held the cold, alien tablet, a sudden shift occurred in the atmosphere around the clearing, a pattern interrupt so subtle it would be missed by anyone not intimately connected to the rhythm of the forest. The gentle breeze that had been moving the high branches ceased, not gradually, but instantly. The normal cacophony of the forest, the insects, the birdsong, the snap of distant twigs, dropped away, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt physically painful in its intensity. This wasn't the silence of absence, it was the silence of observation. Elias, momentarily paralyzed by the cold realization that he was no longer alone, looked up, scanning the dense surrounding foliage. The forest had become a wall of watchful eyes, though he saw nothing concrete. He was enveloped in a sensory deprivation chamber, a pocket of suspended reality carved out of the massive wilderness. He knew instinctively that whatever had arranged the shoes and deposited the black tablet was near, or perhaps was omnipresent in this specific locus of dread. He stuffed the tablet quickly into a specialized, lead-lined evidence pouch he kept for sensitive geological samples, securing the zip with shaking fingers. He didn't dare use his radio. The area was known for dead zones. But the thought of broadcasting his discovery, and possibly revealing his position, felt suicidal. He moved away from the center of the circle, not running, but using the measured, quiet pace of a man trying desperately not to provoke an unseen predator. As he reached the periphery of the clearing, where the darkness under the rhododendrons began to deepen, he stopped. He noticed a detail he had overlooked entirely during his frantic search for the tablet, a detail that provided a horrific counterpoint to the precision of the circle and the alien smoothness of the obsidian. Tied to the highest reachable branch of a towering old-growth cedar, a branch fully 12 feet off the ground, was a child's hair ribbon. It was a faded plaid pattern, the kind used to hold back long pigtails. It was old, weathered by time, but tied with a surprisingly fresh, taut knot. It was impossible for a child to have placed it there, and equally impossible that this ribbon had remained unnoticed through multiple decades and multiple ranger patrols. It was a deliberate, placed marker, a final taunt to the logical human mind. And it wasn't just tied there. It had been woven into the existing moss and lichen, subtly but firmly, like a fisherman securing a line. The white feather, the black tablet, and now the impossibly high, perfectly preserved ribbon. These three objects formed a terrifying unspoken language. It was a narrative of abduction and meticulous planning, stretching back into the forest's obscured past, and now Elias Thorne, the solitary guardian of the trees, had stumbled into the very heart of the operation, armed with nothing but the fading light of a setting sun and a terrifying collection of circumstantial, yet irrefutable evidence that something profoundly wrong, something reaching far beyond standard human crime, was active in his jurisdiction. The shoes were not the end of the story. They were merely the welcome mat, and Elias had just stepped over the threshold. Silas was no longer operating under the pretense of official duty. He was a haunted man pursuing a phantom, driven by the sterile, maddening perfection of the 40 pairs of children's shoes. The official investigation had concluded with a whimper, classifying the discovery as an unsolved artifact anomaly, a bureaucratic euphemism designed to bury the horror under paperwork and jurisdictional apathy. The shoes sat in Evidence Locker 6, individually tagged and sealed, rendered scientifically inert by the complete lack of discernible human trace elements. No fingerprints, no traceable DNA, no stray hairs or fibers, not even the microscopic residue of dirt or decay that should naturally adhere to footwear exposed to the elements for any length of time. They were impossibly pristine. This clinical failure was what truly fractured Silas. How could 40 individual leather and canvas objects, handled by 40 different children, then presumably handled by whoever placed them, offer absolutely zero forensic data? It suggested a level of control, a fastidiousness, or perhaps a method of deposition that bordered on the supernatural, or at the very least defied the laws of probability. He began spending his off hours in the regional archives, not reviewing missing persons reports, which had been exhausted, but delving into the historical records of the Blackwood National Forest itself, searching for patterns that didn't fit neatly into criminal psychology, patterns that smelled of deep earth and older forgotten things. His desperation led him to Dr. Helena Vance, a retired ethnohistorian, who specialized in the neglected folklore and obscure land disputes surrounding the Blackwood watershed. Dr. Vance lived in a crumbling Victorian house 8 miles outside the town limits, a structure entirely engulfed by ivy and shadowed by ancient Douglas firs. The air inside her home was thick with the scent of aged paper, dust, and ozone, a heavy sensory curtain drawn against the modern world. Dr. Vance was a woman of sharp, skeptical eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of things that the local historical society preferred to ignore: the failed commune movements of the 1890s, the catastrophic mining collapses, and the persistent, strange legends of the silent harvest that plagued the earliest logging settlements. Silas presented her with the high-resolution photographs of the shoe circle. He laid out the evidence: the size of the circle, the meticulous spacing, the 40 pairs of shoes ranging from toddler size 6 to youth size 2. Dr. Vance didn't touch the photos. She merely stared at them, her thin lips pressing into a grim line, her silence stretching out until the ticking of the massive grandfather clock in the hall felt like a hammer blow. "They are waiting," she finally whispered, her voice dry as parchment. Silas felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Waiting for what, Doctor?" "This," she gestured vaguely toward the photographs, "is not a crime scene, Ranger. It is an offering, a very large one. The Blackwood has always demanded payment for what is taken from it." usually silence, sometimes life. But this scale, 40 children's shoes. That is a collective demand. We are looking at a pattern that predates recorded history, merely expressed through modern artifacts. She rose stiffly and disappeared into a labyrinthine back room, returning moments later with a heavy cloth-bound ledger, its pages yellowed and fragile. The book contained meticulously copied entries from local magistrates and forest surveyors dating back to the late 19th century. She pointed to specific notations marked in elegant, looping script. "Look at the dates, Ranger. Notice the correlation." Silas leaned closer, tracing the lines with his finger. 1887, 1921, 1954, 1978. In each entry, there was a mention of an inexplicable, circular arrangement of objects found deep within the forest during periods immediately preceding or following major regional crises. A circle of 42 rusted metal tools found just before the Great Mill Fire of 1922. A ring of 39 carefully smoothed river stones, discovered right before the unusually long and brutal winter of 1955, which claimed dozens of lives in the remote settlements. The descriptions were chillingly precise about the geometry. Always a perfect circle, always lacking a discernible path leading to or from the objects. "The numbers vary slightly," Dr. Vance explained, tapping the ledger. "But the function remains the same. These are harvest circles. When the forest itself feels violated, when the balance is shifted too far by extraction or encroachment, the Guardians demand a sign of restitution, an acknowledgement of the cost, a pattern interrupt, as you modern investigators call it." Silas felt the conventional framework of his training collapsing. He had searched for human motive, for sociopathy, for cult activity. He hadn't considered geological or spiritual reciprocity. The Guardians? They are placeholders, Ranger. Beings of the boundary, tied to the deep wood magic. Not ghosts, perhaps, but custodians. And they don't demand adult currency. They demand innocence, or at least the symbolism of innocence. Objects of the unburdened. The shoes represent 40 children who have taken their first steps away from the safety of the known world. The scale was the problem. The previous circles had been small, almost apologetic. 40 pairs of shoes suggested either a massive depletion of resources or a terrifying escalation of the Guardians' influence. Silas realized with a sickening lurch that the last major vanishing wave, the disappearance of 17 individuals, mostly teenagers and young adults, from the Blackwood area over an 18-month period in the late 1990s, had happened only 5 years before the shoes were found. Could the circle be a belated consequence, or perhaps a terrifying preamble? Obsessed, Silas returned to Evidence Locker 6. He managed to secure temporary access under the pretense of cross-referencing materials for a cold case from the adjacent county. He wasn't interested in the shoes' lack of DNA anymore. He needed to understand the 40 individuals they represented. He meticulously photographed and logged the shoes again, this time focusing purely on the subtle signs of wear and construction. The forensic report had dismissed the shoes as standard mixed-brand children's footwear. Silas saw something different. 33 of the 40 pairs were of the same manufacturer, a cheap, durable brand called Trail Trotters, common in rural, lower-income communities throughout the region during the early 2000s. More importantly, the wear patterns were startlingly consistent. The inner soles of all 40 pairs showed signs of being worn for only a short period. No deep molding of the foot, no extreme compression of the arches. They were used, yes, but not habitually loved. They looked like they had been purchased new, worn for a few months, and then abandoned. But the sizing, that was the crucial, terrifying detail the forensic team had missed in their generalized survey. The sizes weren't spread evenly from infancy to adolescence. They were hyper-clustered. Size 6, toddler, through size 2, youth. This represented a very specific developmental window, children between the ages of roughly 4 and 8. It was not a random assortment from a large school or orphanage. It was a precise, curated grouping of early childhood steps. The thought chilled him to the core. If these 40 pairs of shoes represented 40 children who vanished, they represented a single, highly specialized demographic target. It suggested coordination, a group transported and acquired together, or perhaps a highly selective method of removal. He sat in the sterile silence of the evidence room, surrounded by the weight of 40 missing childhoods, when a seemingly innocuous detail from the original crime scene photos finally snapped into focus. The initial forensic photographs, taken immediately after the discovery, showed the ground inside the 15-foot diameter circle. The technicians had focused entirely on the lack of footprints outside the perimeter. They had barely noted the faint, textural aberration within the circle. It wasn't dirt or blood or sap. It was a faint organic pattern etched into the compressed forest floor, almost like a massive, shallow scoring. It was complex and radiating, and the technicians had dismissed it as root encroachment or rodent tunneling. But looking at it now, enlarged and digitally enhanced, Silas saw structure. It looked like the skeletal remains of something biological, perhaps plant or fungal, but arranged with undeniable intent. And this strange, dried structure wasn't circular. It formed 40 distinct radiating lines, each line tracing a path directly from the toe point of a shoe and extending toward the exact center of the circle. The most shocking realization, however, was that these 40 internal lines, once they converged, did not stop. They continued, coalescing into a single massive scar that tracked outward from the circle's edge, traveling in one precise direction, bisecting the surrounding terrain. Silas grabbed his map of the Blackwood National Forest, spreading the worn paper across the stainless steel table. He meticulously triangulated the exact coordinates of the circle and then drew a line corresponding to the exit vector of the organic scar. The line traveled true northwest, cutting through several miles of heavily protected, rarely patrolled old-growth timber across the treacherous, unstable terrain of the area known locally as the Split, before ending abruptly at the mouth of the Whisperwind Ravine, a deep, jagged fracture in the earth, known for its unnerving acoustics and its history of being a burial site for early, failed exploratory expeditions. It was a place where historically sound did not carry, where the deepest parts were perpetually shrouded in mist, and where the compasses of surveyors notoriously spun uselessly. It was the only place in the entire Blackwood Forest that was universally feared by the rangers themselves, and it was entirely unmapped in any official capacity. It was the directional clue, the single biological path the missing 40 had left behind. Silas knew instantly what he had to do. This was beyond bureaucratic protocol. Dr. Vance's words echoed in his mind. They are waiting. They demand silence. The path led to silence. The Whisperwind Ravine was the designated destination of the 40 steps. He secured the necessary gear, not official park issue, but his own privately maintained climbing ropes, heavy-duty flashlight rigs, and a reliable old-model satellite phone that operated outside the standard network. He called Dr. Vance one last time, careful not to reveal the exact nature of his discovery. "Doctor," he said softly, "I think I've found where the arrangement pointed. I am heading to the perimeter of the Whisperwind." There was a long silence on the line, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic chime of the grandfather clock. "Ranger," she finally replied, her voice dropping to a low, intense murmur, "if you go there, you must prepare for the deepest silence you have ever known. The Guardians do not tolerate noise near their resting places. If you hear nothing, if the birds stop singing and the insects cease their chirping, that is your warning. You are not meant to observe this. If you disturb their harvest, the payment they extract may not be symbolic this time." Silas hung up, his hands clammy. He checked his sidearm, the heavy weight offering little comfort against an enemy that might be folklore, or geography, or perhaps the terrible, silent truth of 40 missing children. He left a simple, unaddressed note on his desk, detailing only that he was taking an unscheduled patrol into the northern sector due to a reported landslide near the Split. A lie that would buy him perhaps 36 hours before the alarm was raised. As the sun began its long, creeping descent, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched the trees into skeletal sentinels, Silas parked his unmarked truck miles from the nearest trailhead. The air immediately felt heavier here, damp and ancient. He shouldered his pack, the map clutched tightly in his hand, the single line drawn across it screaming the location of the undeniable truth. He took his first deliberate step off the marked path, committing himself fully to the silence of the Blackwood, following the ghost line of the perfect circle of 40 children's shoes toward the terrifying, gaping maw of the Whisperwind Ravine, where he suspected the 40 steps of early childhood had finally reached their unsettling and eternal resting place. He knew that if the silence truly found him, he might never be able to leave. His heart hammered a desperate rhythm against the growing, suffocating stillness of the deep woods. Elias stood at the edge of the perimeter line, the yellow tape now sagging and forgotten, a flimsy barrier against the crushing weight of the unknown that permeated the air. The official investigation had stalled, reaching the infuriating precipice of unexplained environmental anomaly, followed by massive, untraceable disappearance. Detective Hayes, exhausted and defeated, had reluctantly pulled the bulk of the federal team out, leaving behind only a skeletal crew and a mandate to wait for the inevitable cold case file. But Elias could not wait. The stillness of the forest floor, usually a blanket of rustling organic life, was now a void, a chitinous silence that absorbed sound and light. It felt like standing in the auditory shadow of a cosmic scream. He approached the circle again, this time alone, guided not by duty or forensic protocol, but by the raw, visceral instinct that had drawn him to the spot initially. The 40 pairs of shoes remained exactly as they had been found, untouched since the initial cataloguing, the synthetic materials resisting decay, preserving the terrible geometric perfection of their arrangement. Toddler sneakers, scuffed sandals, tiny boots, all pointing inward, all positioned with a radial symmetry that defied accident or haste. It was the precision, the sheer unrelenting order of the abandonment that screamed of the unnatural. Elias knelt beside a pair of worn blue canvas shoes, size 13, noticing a detail that the pressure of the initial discovery and the chaos of the subsequent investigation had obscured. He hadn't just noted the arrangement, he had felt the residual energy of the placement. Now, with the forest hushed around him, he realized the alignment was not merely radial, it was also subtly offset. Each pair was tilted fractionally, perhaps 3 degrees clockwise from true north, a minuscule deviation that suggested movement, not merely placement. It was the footprint of a mechanism, not a ritual. A sound broke the suffocating silence, the hurried crunch of boots on pine needles, and then the breathless voice of Dr. Lena Rossi. She looked haggard, her eyes wide with a combination of terror and profound, terrifying comprehension. She carried a tablet, its screen blazing with obscure historical diagrams and high-resolution scans of the artifact they had recovered days earlier, the piece of braided carbon fiber and non-native crystalline obsidian. "Elias, stop," she whispered, her voice tight with adrenaline. "Don't touch the center, don't even cross the threshold. I know what this is. I think I know where they went." She collapsed onto a nearby fallen log, rapidly pulling up the data. "The fiber artifact, it's not local. It's not even earth-woven, not in the sense we understand industrial materials. It's a mnemonic anchor, Elias, a residue, and the obsidian. It's laced with microscopic inclusions of material that align perfectly with the geological readings we dismissed as deep earth tremor noise. They aren't tremors, they are pulses." Rossi swiped the screen to display a complex diagram overlaid onto a topographical map of the region. "I spent the last 48 hours cross-referencing this location's unique geological markers, the high quartz concentration, the specific hydrostatic flow of the subterranean river system, with ancient, fringe astronomical charts. Charts that are centuries old, charting patterns that human science only recently rediscovered. They all point to this single spot. This valley is a known, cyclical nexus point." Elias felt the hairs stand up on his arms, a cold realization settling over him. A nexus, a thin spot. "Thinner than thin," Rossi confirmed, tracing the lines on the screen with a trembling finger. Historically, these spots are known for 2 things: massive, localized energetic discharge, and the disappearance of untethered vessels, children, the mentally pure, individuals not yet fully anchored to the rigidity of adulthood. This isn't a random forest. It's a harmonic convergence zone, used almost like a natural transit station. She zoomed in on the geometric design of the diagram. The pattern was a perfect circle, 40 radiating lines. The perfect circle wasn't constructed by cultists meticulously measuring 40 placements. The circle is the imprint of the energetic field itself. The pressure wave created by the opening of the Nexus forces objects left within its immediate radius into a state of Euclidean perfection. It wasn't arranged, it was aligned by a force stronger than gravity. The implications slammed into Elias with physical force. Hayes had dismissed the perfection as a bizarre ritualistic signature, a sign of human dedication. But if the arrangement was a natural artifact of the event, it meant the mechanism was not religious but cosmic and precise. "The shoes," Elias muttered, looking back at the sea of leather and plastic. 40 pairs. Why 40? Rossi's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, echoing the chilling conclusions she had drawn from the esoteric texts. In many ancient cosmological frameworks, specifically those concerning cyclical transference, 40 is the number of transition, completion, and shedding of the temporary. Not 40 specific children, Elias, but the collective 40, the complete current generation ready for the passage. They weren't abducted. They weren't sacrificed. She paused, taking a ragged breath that seemed to fill the silent valley. They transferred, Rossi finished, the word hanging like a judgment. The shoes are the anchor, the mnemonic signature left behind, signifying the deliberate rejection of their material, earthly tether. When the Nexus opens, the energy field essentially strips the physical mass away, leaving only the anchor points, the items they were standing in or holding, in perfect residual alignment. As she spoke, the air around them began to subtly change. It wasn't temperature or wind, it was a shift in density, a synesthetic dread that tasted metallic on the tongue. The familiar scent of pine and redwood vanished, replaced by an ozone sharpness, the scent of impending electrical discharge. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate, a low, subsonic thrumming that was felt more than heard. Elias looked at Rossi, his eyes wide with rising panic. "The seismic anomaly Hayes reported this morning, it wasn't a precursor, was it?" "No," she confirmed, frantically checking her tablet. The readings showed massive, localized energy spikes, originating precisely at the center of the shoe circle. The texts indicated that the alignment, while rare, adheres strictly to the cycle. "We miscalculated the peak. We thought we had days or weeks based on the geological rate of energy buildup. We were wrong. The final stellar alignment has been achieved. The Nexus is reopening right now." The sound intensified, a high-pitched whine that resonated deep in the bone marrow, accompanied by a flickering, almost imperceptible distortion of the air above the circle. The world seemed to wobble at the edges, the rigid geometry of the surrounding trees blurring momentarily. Elias pushed past his terror, the ranger instinct taking over. He pulled Rossi back toward the safety line. "We have to move. If this is an energetic discharge, it could atomize us." But Rossi stood rooted, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Wait, we might get a glimpse. We might see the transfer in action, Elias. We need to understand the mechanism." Against his better judgment, Elias stopped, turning his gaze back to the shoes. The tiny sneakers suddenly seemed to glow faintly, absorbing the strange internal light of the energy field. Then he saw it. It wasn't a replay or a residual image. It was a pure, overwhelming sensory download, a moment of psychic intrusion into the event that had occurred just hours or perhaps minutes before they arrived. He saw the children, all 40 of them, standing quietly within their designated spots. Not crying, not afraid, but expectant. They were illuminated by an internal, soft gold light that seemed to pulse in time with the geological thrumming. He saw their faces, blank, serene, devoid of individual personality, subsumed into a collective readiness. They were not victims. They were participants in a process they inherently understood. And then, the moment of revelation, the horrifying truth of the perfect circle. The children didn't step out of the shoes, they didn't run. As the energy crescendoed, the ground pulsed violently. A column of light, not burning but pure overwhelming photonic energy, erupted silently from the exact empty center of the circle. The light wasn't vertical, it was hemispherical, enveloping the 40 children, and as the light touched them, Elias saw the geometric force Rossi had described, The children, still standing, were momentarily compressed and ordered by the field. Their bodies, their earthly forms, held in perfect hydrostatic alignment, the pressure momentarily locking their shoes into the forest floor. The transition was instantaneous and quiet. They simply ceased to be. The light absorbed them completely, leaving behind 40 pairs of shoes perfectly aligned, the material anchors left precisely where the geometric pressure had fixed them before the light column snapped shut, sucking the remaining energy and the horrifying stillness back into the earth. Elias gasped, stumbling backward, the vision tearing itself from his mind. He tasted blood, metallic and cold. The air snapped back to normal. The ozone smell vanished. The forest sounds, the distant cry of a hawk, the rustle of leaves, rushed back in, deafening in their sudden normalcy. The ground was still. The energy field was gone. The transition point was closed. Rossi was shaking, having witnessed the environmental backlash without the visual context. "What did you see, Elias? What was it?" He could only point, his hand trembling violently, toward the center of the circle, where the grass was now utterly scorched, not by fire, but by pure energetic sterility. They chose the circle. It wasn't a fight, it was an appointment. Just then, the sound of a heavy vehicle tearing through the underbrush signaled the return of Detective Hayes. He burst onto the scene, flanked by 2 remaining deputies, his face etched with worry and official annoyance. "Vance, Rossi, what the hell is going on? We had massive energy spikes registered across the entire national grid tied to this location. Are you guys running some kind of unauthorized experiment?" "I told you this area was closed." Hayes strode toward the circle, his eyes scanning for damage, for evidence of a struggle, for anything that matched the energy readings. He looked at the 40 pairs of shoes, and then at Elias and Rossi, their faces pale and profoundly scarred by what they knew. "Well?" Hayes demanded, waving his hand toward the inert evidence. "Any closer to finding the kids? Was it some kind of synchronized jump? Did they use some kind of chemical agent? The environmental report came back negative on everything." Elias looked at Hayes, the procedural man, the man who required blueprints and motive, and knew that the truth, the horrible, beautiful, geometric truth of the silent procession, could never be articulated in a police report. He looked at the shoes, now just shoes again, inert and lifeless. "No, Detective," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We found nothing new, no trace evidence, no sign of struggle. It remains a mass disappearance." Rossi nodded slowly, understanding the mutual pact of silence and necessary professional deception. The true conclusion was epistemologically impossible for the system they served. The official file, filed under the cold, sterile heading of mass disappearance, suspected cult activity, non-violent migration, gathered dust almost immediately. The public theory settled on a fanatical religious group that had led the children into the wilderness, dissolving into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the continent. Elias Vance returned to his post, quietly rerouting hiking trails, ensuring that no human settlement would ever encroach upon the perfect, quiet geometry of the Nexus Valley. He and Rossi exchanged silent, knowing glances whenever the subject arose in hushed tones, burdened by the knowledge of a reality far more expansive and precise than humanity was prepared to acknowledge. The shoes remained locked away in a secure federal vault, 40 static reminders of a generation that simply walked out of existence, leaving behind their earthly shells in a circle of mathematically terrifying perfection, awaiting the next cyclical alignment, the next generation to be called by the silent, organized power of the forest. The only question that haunted Elias, echoing in the subsequent stillness of the protected valley, was not why the 40 children left, but what grand alien mechanism they had joined, and when the earth would next shed its young. We are left, then, with the residue, the echo of the transference. The shoes are gone, but the knowledge remains. If you ever find yourself walking in the deepest parts of the woods, far from any established path, and the air around you suddenly drops into an unnatural, vacuum-like silence, if you feel the ground vibrating beneath your boots with a deep, low frequency that defies logic, do not look down. Do not stop. Keep moving, for you might just be stumbling upon a place where the veil between worlds is thinning and the universe is preparing its next perfectly aligned appointment. And if you see a flicker of light, or the shadow of geometric perfection where there should be only chaos and nature, remember the shoes. Remember the 40, and wonder what small material item you might leave behind if called upon to shed your own tether to this earth.